Cool. I'm going to shift gears now. And we're going to talk about how the cycle works. Um, your menstrual cycle is sort of like the four seasons. There are four phases of the cycle and four seasons in the year if you live in the Northern Hemisphere. In the north of the Northern Hemisphere, you experience four seasons. Not at where everybody lives on the planet gets four seasons, but if you've ever lived somewhere with four seasons, then you know what I'm talking about. So the menstrual cycle is sort of like winter. It's sort of like a hibernation season. The follicular phase, which comes after menstruation, is sort of like spring. It's like when the ground starts to melt and little plants start to push up through the soil. Like that's what's happening inside of your body, inside of the ovaries with your eggs. They're being gestated to the point of maturity. Ovulation is like summertime, and that's when the flowers burst open, and that's when the egg releases from the ovary. And then in autumn, we've got the luteal phase, which is this phase of coming back down and toward hibernation, towards wintertime. It's when the hormones start to descend. It's when the uterine lining starts to deteriorate, leading up to the next round, the next cycle, menstruation again. So I like to think about those four different phases like the seasons, because it can be a little bit overwhelming how to relate to your body in a cyclical way without a reference point for something that's familiar. I'm going to go into this in depth here in a moment with some diagrams about what the hormones are doing, but I just want to just normalize how confusing this all can be the first time. If this is your first time really consuming this information, just, relax. You can have a replay of this. You can watch it over and over again, but just know that there are four main phases and four main seasons, and they kind of sort of overlap. And if you want to take it a step further to anchor it kind of more specifically into the timeline of the four phases of the lunar cycle, which is how our bodies actually cycle. We don't menstruate 4 times a year, right? We actually menstruate once a month, which is a 28-day cycle-ish for most people. And the four lunar phases sort of similarly overlap, right? And not everybody menstruates the same anymore. We used to live a lot closer to the land, right? We used to be out in nature underneath the moon with a much deeper harmony in our physiology with the physiology of the physical earth. And so I almost hesitate to liken the comparison, because so many women's bodies in our modern lives aren't really synced up with the moon anymore. However, we used to have a lot less in the way of that, less environmental toxin, less stress, more like social cohesion in a tribe, more interaction with each other and other women. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the Infradian rhythm in a little bit, but that's essentially that's the 28-day cycle of how the way that the body syncs with the moon is a thing. It's called the Infradian rhythm. It's a sister cycle to the circadian rhythm, which is a solar rhythm, right? We all know that the circadian rhythm governs things like sleep and digestion and heart rate. And every mammal anyways following that with their sleep and waking and digestion patterns, and in that way men and women are the same, right? But this is one of the biggest differentiations, is that women uniquely follow the Infradian rhythm as well. So we live this interesting balance between these two cosmic bodies that like ebb and flow and pull on the waters in our bodies and on the fluids in our bodies, particularly with the Infradian rhythm. So yeah, like learning to understand how your body cycles 28 days through these four phases of the menstrual cycle uniquely, differently than men, changes the game and really changes everything when you don't expect your body to be the same every single day. It doesn't operate on that 24-hour timeline entirely. Some things do, some processes do, like our sleep and digestion processes, but much of our energetic process, like how much energy we have and how we like our best spending ourselves like a battery we don't recharge and fuel back up on 24-hour cycles. It's more of a 28-day cycle. So that's a really exciting topic to me that I think changes the game just as much. And it is one that reinforces the first thing that I said at the beginning of this webinar. If you take nothing else away from here, is that you need to rest. Well, this infradian rhythm really does give us that winter season of rest and truly gives us permission to understand how our body needs that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. If there's one other thing, like the second most important thing that I would want you to take away from today, is that understanding that ovulation is the main event, and everything that you can know about your body and whether it's ovulating and how it's ovulating is going to empower you to answer most of the questions that you have. Most people think menstruation is the main event in the female reproductive cycle. It's not. It's ovulation. Ovulation is so important. So I want to talk about the hormones of the female reproductive system now. And I'm going to show you a graph while I do it, because I'm a visual gal. Cool, you can see that. So in the top of this graph, we've got two hormones depicted, the follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and the luteinizing hormone, or LH. And then the next section down is what's going on in the ovary. And the next section down is what's going on in the hormones that are produced in our ovaries, estrogen and progesterone. The next section down is what the uterine lining is up to in the 4 phases of the cycle. Okay, so I'm going to kind of walk us through this. Coming back up to the very top, FSH is made in the pituitary gland, and it's the hormone that stimulates the most advanced follicle, an egg, to mature. Okay, so it's the one that says, this egg is the one this month, and we're gonna kick that one into gear. This is made in the pituitary gland in the brain. Okay, so there's an intricate dance between what is happening in the brain and what is happening in the ovaries and what's going on in the thyroid. There's those 3 main areas where all these hormones kind of cycle and loop and talk to each other. And I'm oversimplifying it here because we're speaking about some intensely complicated biology in a 2-hour workshop, so I'm not going to go all the way into it. But just so you know, things are kicked off with FSH. Estrogen, if you're looking on the second one, it peaks, and these are the days in which these little vertical lines are corresponded to in the very bottom here, the days of the cycle. Estrogen starts to rise there around day 10, and estrogen is produced in the ovaries, and this is in a way like communicated from the pituitary gland down to the ovaries that it's time to make more estrogen. And when it does, it stimulates the uterine lining to start to thicken. So right around the same time, the uterine lining starts to thicken. You can see that early on, like day 10 or so. And then the follicle stimulating hormone says, this is the egg that's going to be released. And then luteinizing hormone comes online, which is also made in the pituitary gland. You see on that top graph. This stimulates once that egg and follicle are ready. It stimulates the follicle to release the egg, resulting in ovulation. So if you look at the second graph here, The follicle is inside of the ovary, and it's like a little, there's several billion of them floating around inside of each of your ovaries. And they're all of the eggs and all the follicles you'll have your entire life are present in your body at birth. In fact, some of the interesting things that I was speaking about before this workshop in my marketing was that your egg that you came from was alive inside of your grandmother's body, in the fetus of your mother. You were in your mother's ovary, in your grandmother's belly. It's just pretty wild when you think about that from an epigenetic perspective of how this matrilineal line and the things your grandmother went through when she was pregnant with your mom, and then the things your mom went through when she was pregnant for you. All of that's kind of stored in your reproductive memory in some way. I digress. That's a tangent. So we're here with the follicle. Follicle stimulating hormone chose this one, and estrogen started the process of maturing the uterine lining to the point right before ovulation, when what happens here is really nuts, you guys. Ovulation is when the egg releases from the follicle, okay, comes to maturation, releases from the follicle out of the ovary. It goes into the abdominal cavity for a moment, and then it finds its way to the fimbriae of the follicle, of the fallopian tubes, and then down into the uterus. Okay, while the egg is making its transition down to find the uterine lining, the follicle turns into the corpus luteum, which it shifts from this little incubation sac for an egg and turns into a hormone production place. So it starts producing the hormone progesterone. After ovulation, progesterone is produced by the what was the follicle and is now the corpus luteum. Okay, that's really important because this is the only way your body makes progesterone. Progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum, which is, as I said, the follicle, which was the follicle which morphs into this hormone factory. And progesterone signals the uterine lining to stop thickening by limiting estrogen and maintains the thickness. So it is really important for, if you think about the inside of the uterus like a garden, it's really important for your soil to be well amended before you plant seeds in it, right? If you have soil that's dead or dry or over gardened and doesn't have any nutrients left, it's not going to produce very good garden or veggies, right? It's the same thing with the uterine lining. Understanding the health of the uterine lining is the missing piece in most Western gynecology today. They're not paying attention to it. And this is something that's very well understood with traditional Chinese medicine, gynecology, and women's folk gynecology, which have been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So understanding the importance of progesterone in, it's like the biggest nutrient of taking care of the garden, of nurturing the uterine lining. And so we'll get to later on in my presentation about some of the menstrual cycle dysfunctions we see when progesterone's not doing what it should. Some things like shorter cycles or anovulatory cycles. But for now, with this diagram up, I just want you to look down at the lower portion of it, which shows the uterine lining doing its thing. So we've got the follicular phase starting. Well, this is it's an interesting menstruation. They like have it boxed off within the follicular phase a little bit. That's a little not quite accurate. So we've got menstruation at the beginning for the first 3 to 4 to 5 days. Ideally, they've got this one going to 7 days, where the uterine lining is shedding, right? It's going down a lot. The follicular phase continues towards ovulation, where we see this is when estrogen starts to rise and starts to build the uterine lining. And then we see that pink middle section there, the peak, where follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone peak. This is where the egg is matured and released, and when progesterone starts to be produced. And then you start to see the uterine lining descending, and towards the end of this graft, it's starting to get like frazzled out, and then it empties out. What's interesting to note is, like, from the bottom to the top of this uterine lining graft, the uterus itself expands to be twice as big when it's full, when the uterine lining is fully developed. So think about right before your period, right before you start bleeding, your uterus is twice as big as it is right after, like at the beginning of your follicular phase. When you think about the diagram, or the diagram, and also this model I showed you, there's just not a lot of wiggle room in here. These organs are all nestled together really tightly. And when you have one of them swelling to twice its size, it creates a lot of pressure on the other ones and a feeling of heaviness. And it makes sense that your body is just feels different, right? Just from that fact alone. Okay. One last thing I want you to see. You're not quite going to see it all lined up with this in the same graph on this one, but you can sort of overlay them with your mind. These hormones doing their things at different points during the menstrual cycle, you can see that they all start to tank towards day 23, 24, just before you start menstruating. All your hormones tank. And the reason why some women have such terrible mood swings is because they don't have an even drop at the end of their cycle. There's an intense shelf, and that can be addressed with a lot of different things that help the flow of the hormones work. But it's also just understandable that the end of your cycle, you would have different mental states than during ovulation, when your estrogen and progesterone are peaking, for example. So understanding how you're a 28-day cyclical being, and understanding your infradian rhythm, understanding your hormone fluctuation, it gives you the opportunity to be gentle with yourself around those changes, around those different times when you're more internal and you just don't really, like, perhaps just before menstruation, you're not really interested in engaging with people like you are during ovulation, when your hormones are high and your brain function's high. So I share that with you to kind of just relax of all of the pressures around everybody's got to be on all the time, and it's just not true when we're really paying attention to the hormones. So I said ovulation's the main event, and really it has a lot to do with things we'll talk about in a minute about fertility and how to avoid getting pregnant. But really, I want to just remind you about the benefits of progesterone, the hormone that's produced from the corpus luteum during ovulation. So progesterone is really, really, really important. We want to make sure we're ovulating, because if we don't have this very important hormone. And what progesterone does is it eases anxiety. It promotes memory. It helps prevent overgrowth of certain types of cells, which can protect us from certain cancers of the breast and uterus. So making sure that young girls ovulate instead of getting put on hormonal birth control, for example, can help them later in life as a cancer preventative. It helps prevent fibrocystic diseases like ovarian cysts. Often girls get put on hormonal birth control, their body stops making progesterone, and women too, and then they get cystic. And I don't know if you've ever had an ovarian cyst rupture in your body, but it feels like you've been shot, and it's one of the scariest things that I've experienced and seen some women experience, and we just don't know what's going on. So I want to prevent that from happening. It helps with all the symptoms of PMS. A lot of what has been considered PMS is just a lack of progesterone in the body. It's because we've been drugged and stressed out to the point where we don't ovulate anymore. It helps metabolism by contributing to the use of fat for energy. The progesterone actually helps your body burn fat. Um, it assists in preventing plaque from forming on the arterial walls. It's essential for bone growth. It assists in the proper function of the thyroid gland. It can help slow down the aging process. It improves insomnia. It improves libido. It reduces or eliminates migraines. It reduces inflammation and joint pain. And hot flashes and weight gain are also regulated with progesterone. So just ovulating is actually like really good for our health. So hormonal birth control stops all of that from happening. And hormonal birth control includes taking the pill or having an IUD with the hormonal IUD, and sometimes even a copper IUD can disrupt the normal functioning of the hormones. And then there's the Depo shot and the NuvaRing and all the new, I think that there may be even arm implants with chemical drugs in them. And all of that, even though you bleed, that's not an actual period. It's a drug. It's sort of like they put drugs in on certain days, and then there's a couple days where your body, like with a hormonal birth control pill, those white pills are placebos. There's nothing in them, but your body actually bleeds because it's like a withdrawal bleed from the chemicals. It's not an actual, your uterine lining is not building and releasing like it does naturally, and you're not producing progesterone on those drugs. So those are all the reasons why I don't like them, especially for young women whose reproductive systems are just learning how to work, right? We're just starting to get things figured out and just getting in the rhythm of producing and maturing an egg every month and releasing it. Like it takes some time. And for some girls, like 3, 4, 5 years to get that process kind of nailed down, especially if they're in households where there's stress or not proper nutrition, or they're exercising heavy, or there's pressure in some way. Like there's a lot of pressure on young girls that disrupts their menstrual cycle. And especially for young women, we see how sensitive our reproductive system really is. They're an open book. And what we do in unfortunately, in most Western gynecologists will just be like, well, put her on hormonal birth control because that'll at least like stop the symptoms, but it doesn't solve anything. It doesn't heal anything. Okay. So that's my rant about hormonal birth control. I probably won't be saying much about that anymore unless anybody has a specific ask about it.